Your last name is not your bloodline. And if you've spent years believing your surname connects you to an African clan, a kingdom, or an ancestral family line, what you're about to hear is going to change how you see your own name forever. Here's the claim that keeps circulating online, that certain black surnames are secretly tied to specific African clans, and that if you carry one of them, your DNA will confirm exactly which African family, tribe, or kingdom you descend from. It sounds exciting. It sounds like a shortcut to something slavery tried to erase, but it's not true. And understanding why it's not true actually reveals something far more powerful than any fake clan list ever could. Let's start with the number one myth almost everyone believes without question, that Black Americans simply inherited their surnames from the people who enslaved their ancestors. It feels logical, it's repeated constantly, and it's only partly true at best. Genealogists who have spent decades combing through plantation records, emancipation documents, and census data have found that this assumption doesn't hold up nearly as consistently as people think. Enslaved people, for most of their lives in bondage, weren't even recorded with surnames at all. They were listed by first name only, sometimes not even that, reduced to numbers and property descriptions in ledgers written for the benefit of slaveholders, not for the people themselves. Surnames only entered the picture when documentation demanded it, or after freedom finally came. Records from the Reconstruction era back this up in detail. Genealogists and historians who specialize in this period describe the years right after emancipation as a kind of naming frontier, a moment when millions of newly freed people, for the first time in their lives, had the legal right to formally choose and register a family name of their own. Some chose to honor a parent or grandparent separated from them by sale. Some chose names tied to the plantation or region they'd finally left behind, as a marker of survival rather than ownership. And some simply kept whatever name had already become known in their community, regardless of where it originally came from, because changing it again risked confusing the very reunification efforts many families were desperately pursuing at the time. And when freedom did come, something remarkable happened that most people never learn about. Newly emancipated people didn't automatically default to their former enslaver's name. Many of them made a deliberate personal choice. Some picked names to represent their new status entirely. Names like Freedman, chosen specifically to declare, on paper for the first time in their lives, that they belonged to no one. Others chose names connected to figures they admired, to skills they carried, to families they'd been separated from and hoped to reunite with. This wasn't inheritance. This was identity being built from scratch, by force of will, in the years immediately after one of the most brutal systems in human history finally ended. So here's the first hard truth. If your surname wasn't reliably inherited from an enslaver, it wasn't reliably inherited from an African ancestor either, because enslaved Africans arriving in America were stripped of their original names on arrival, sometimes on the ships themselves, then a surname alone was never capable of pointing back to a specific African clan in the first place. The chain was broken at multiple points, deliberately, by a system designed to erase exactly the kind of continuity a clan name would require. And there's a second layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. Even the names enslaved Africans arrived with weren't preserved in any consistent way. Ship captains, traders, and plantation owners routinely assigned new names on arrival, often simple English first names, sometimes deliberately humiliating ones, stripped of any connection to the language, family structure, or naming traditions of the person's actual homeland. In many West African cultures, names carried enormous weight, tied to birth order, ancestral lineage, spiritual meaning, or the specific circumstances of a child's birth. A name wasn't just an identifier. It was a form of documented family history, passed down with intention. That entire system was erased the moment a person was forced onto a ship, and it was erased again when record keepers on American soil wrote down whatever name was convenient for their own paperwork. So even tracing backward from the African side, a surname trail simply doesn't survive the crossing. Now let's talk about why DNA and surnames don't automatically work together for Black Americans the way they do for other populations. Because this is the part almost nobody explains clearly, and it's the actual science behind why this myth falls apart. In genetic genealogy, there's a real, legitimate research method called a surname study. It works like this. A surname gets passed down through the paternal line, father to son, generation after generation. The Y-chromosome, the genetic material that only biological males carry and that only passes from father to son, also travels along that exact same paternal line. So in populations where surnames have stayed intact and unbroken for centuries, like certain British, Irish, or Scottish family lines, researchers can actually match a surname to a specific Y-chromosome signature with real confidence. If your surname is Campbell and your Y DNA matches the known Campbell genetic signature, that's a legitimate science-backed connection. But here's exactly where the method collapses for the vast majority of Black American family lines. And this is the single most important fact in this entire video. When African American men take Y-DNA tests, a strikingly large number of them discover their Y chromosome traces back to European origin, not African origin. That's not a data error. That's a documented genetic record of a specific historical reality. Enslavers routinely fathered children with the women they held in bondage. Since the Y chromosome follows the same direct paternal inheritance pattern as a surname, this means that for a huge number of Black American men, the paternal DNA line and the paternal surname line don't point back to an African ancestor at all. They point back to the white slaveholding family whose name may or may not have even been kept. Think about what that actually means. It means that even in cases where a Black family's surname matches a documented slaveholding family's name, the DNA connection, if it's followed, might not lead you to that family's African captives. It might lead you directly into that family's own bloodline. This isn't a hypothetical. It's been proven in one of the most famous cases in the entire history of genetic genealogy. Genetic testing definitively established that Thomas Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, a woman he held enslaved at Monticello. That case became a landmark moment for the entire field because it proved, with hard genetic evidence, exactly the kind of hidden paternal history that surnames alone could never reveal, and that official records were never going to admit on their own. So when a video promises you that 15 specific Black surnames will reveal your true African clan, ask yourself what that claim would actually require to be true. It would require that every person carrying that surname today descends from an unbroken, documented paternal line stretching back through slavery, back through the middle, passage, back to a specific identifiable community in Africa, with no interruption, no renaming, no coerced relationships, and no post-emancipation reinvention anywhere along the way. Given everything we just walked through, that's not just unlikely. For the overwhelming majority of Black American families, it's close to impossible. No legitimate genetics lab, university genealogy program, or historical archive has ever published a verified list matching specific surnames to specific African clans, because the historical record required to make that claim responsibly simply doesn't exist. It's also worth pointing out how genealogists themselves approach this problem in real research, because it's far more careful and far more interesting than any shortcut list. Professional researchers tracing enslaved ancestors typically build out an entire family tree for the last known enslaver first, then cross-reference migration patterns, shared locations, and documented relationships across multiple archives, census records, probate documents, plantation deeds, and Reconstruction-era paperwork. One well-documented case involved a genealogist tracing an ancestor born enslaved in Arkansas in the 1840s, working backward through census records to identify the likely enslaving family based on shared birthplaces and household composition. That is painstaking document-by-document detective work. It is the opposite of a 15-name list promising instant answers, and it's the reason serious African-American genealogy is treated as one of the most rewarding, yet genuinely difficult branches of family history research anywhere in the world. There's another wrinkle worth understanding too, because it explains why even white slaveholding surnames can be misleading in the opposite direction. Common English surnames like Johnson, Williams, Jackson, or Smith appear constantly across both white and Black American families. Not because every Black family named Johnson descends from one specific Johnson plantation, but because these were simply some of the most common surnames in the English-speaking world at the time, carried by thousands of unrelated slaveholding families across dozens of states. That means a shared surname between a Black family and a white family today tells you almost nothing on its own. It's a coincidence of naming popularity, not evidence of a specific shared bloodline. Only DNA testing, cross-referenced with documentary research, can actually confirm whether two families sharing a common surname are genetically connected at all. So if surnames can't do it, what actually can? This is where the real story gets interesting, because the answer isn't disappointing. It's the opposite. It's the reason an entire field of genetic science exists specifically to solve the exact problem surnames can't solve. Autosomal DNA testing looks at genetic material inherited from both parents, mixed and diluted across every generation, and it can estimate broad regional ancestry with real accuracy, often placing someone's origins within specific West African nations, and increasingly, specific ethnic groups within those nations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down only through the direct maternal line, mother to mother to mother unbroken, can trace a single ancestral thread back tens of thousands of years, often surviving intact, even when paternal lines were disrupted by slavery's violence. And where Y-DNA does trace to African origin, rather than European origin, it can still connect a man to a specific ancestral migration path, independent of whatever surname history happened to attach itself along the way. In other words, the tools that actually work are the ones that don't depend on a name surviving intact through centuries of forced displacement. They depend on the DNA itself, which, unlike a name, can't be erased, renamed, or reassigned by anyone. This is also where DNA matching becomes genuinely practical for reconnecting living relatives, not just estimating regional percentages. Genetic genealogists now routinely help Black families identify likely relatives who share DNA but carry completely different surnames. Descendants of ancestors who were separated during slavery, sold to different enslavers, and forced to rebuild family identity from scratch under entirely different names. By comparing shared genetic matches, common geographic locations, and overlapping family trees, researchers can often reconstruct relationships that no surname search could ever have revealed. Some of these matches even connect Black American families to enslavers' documented descendants, filling in enslaver identities that existing paper records never named directly. This kind of work is slow, often frustrating, and requires combining DNA evidence with traditional archival research. But it consistently succeeds, where surname-based searching alone hits a permanent dead end. And this is exactly why 2025's biggest ancestry data update matters so much more than any surname list ever could. One of the largest genetic testing companies in the world announced a massive expansion of its African ancestry research, expanding from 25 broad African genetic groupings to more than 250 high-resolution regional groups, built through years of direct partnership with African communities and verified four-grandparent ancestry data. More than 80% of Black and African American customers using the newest testing technology now match to one or more of these high-resolution groups. That's not a name on a list, that's an actual genetic signature, reconstructed from your own DNA, connecting you to real, specific, still existing communities across West Africa. The exact thing a fabricated surname to clan list could never honestly deliver. There's also a common counter-question worth addressing directly, because someone watching this is probably already thinking it. If surnames can't reliably trace clan origin, why do so many videos, articles, and social media posts keep insisting they can? Part of the answer is simply that it's a compelling, simple story. A name, a click, an instant answer, no complicated genetic testing required. It's the kind of claim that spreads easily precisely because it feels empowering and requires no verification from the viewer. But a compelling story and an accurate one aren't always the same thing. And when it comes to a history as painful and as deliberately obscured as slavery, accuracy matters more than convenience. Handing someone a fabricated clan name based on a surname coincidence isn't reconnecting them to their history. It's replacing one erasure with a different kind of false comfort. Let's also be honest about something else, because this matters for how you think about your own name going forward. The fact that your surname likely isn't a direct genetic breadcrumb trail doesn't make it meaningless. It means something different, and in some ways something more powerful. Every surname carried by a Black American family today, whatever its origin, has survived slavery, survived Reconstruction, survived Jim Crow, survived the Great Migration, and been carried forward by real people who built entire lives, communities, and legacies under that name. Whether it was chosen in the first days of freedom or passed down through a complicated, painful history, it represents endurance. It represents identity claimed and rebuilt, generation after generation, against a system that tried to prevent exactly that from happening. There's also a growing movement worth mentioning here because it shows this conversation isn't just academic. It's personal for millions of people right now. A rising number of Black Americans today are actively researching, reclaiming, and in some cases deliberately redefining their surnames, treating the process as both a genealogical investigation and a form of cultural reckoning. For many, discovering that a surname likely traces to a European family rather than an African one isn't an ending to the search. It's the beginning of a more accurate one, using DNA evidence and archival research together instead of relying on a name to do work it was never capable of doing alone. This shift shows up in real stories, not just statistics. Some people, after finally identifying a documented enslaving family through years of combined DNA and archival work, describe it as recovering a missing piece of their own identity, a starting point for exploring what happened to their ancestors, where they were held, and what migration paths their descendants eventually took. Others take a different path entirely, choosing to adopt new names that reflect African heritage discovered through DNA testing rather than a surname inherited through slavery's paper trail. Neither approach is more valid than the other. What matters is that both are built on accurate information rather than a fabricated shortcut. And that distinction is exactly what separates responsible historical storytelling from content designed purely to generate clicks off a painful and complicated history. It's also worth understanding what happens practically once someone identifies a likely African region or ethnic group through DNA rather than through a surname guess. High-resolution ancestry matches can open the door to real cultural reconnection, language resources, historical context about specific kingdoms and trading networks, and in some cases, direct contact with contemporary communities in the identified region. Several genealogy and heritage organizations have begun facilitating exactly this kind of reconnection, treating DNA results not as an endpoint, but as a starting point for cultural exchange between diaspora descendants and present-day African communities. That is a fundamentally different outcome than a surname list ever could have produced, because it's grounded in verifiable biological evidence rather than a coincidence of shared spelling. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding because it ties everything back together. The 250-plus high-resolution African genetic groups now available weren't built by guessing based on modern surnames or family legends. They were built by comparing DNA directly against reference samples collected from people with verified, documented ancestry inside specific African nations, people whose grandparents were confirmed born in that same country. That verification process is exactly what a surname can never provide. A name can be changed in a single generation by a court clerk, a former enslaver, or a personal choice made the week after emancipation. A genetic signature inherited from a great-great-great-grandparent cannot be changed by anyone at any point for any reason. That difference is the entire reason this field of science exists, and it's the reason DNA, not surname records, has become the primary tool for millions of families trying to answer the same question you might be asking right now. So the real reveal here isn't a secret 15-name list connecting you to a hidden African kingdom. The real reveal is this: your surname's story and your DNA's story are often two completely separate histories, shaped by two completely different forces, one by choice, coercion, and survival in America, and the other by unbroken biological inheritance stretching back to specific African peoples who still exist today. Understanding the difference between those two stories isn't a disappointment. It's the first step toward actually finding the real one, using the tools that were built specifically to recover what slavery worked so hard to erase. If you want to know where your ancestors actually came from, the answer was never going to be sitting quietly inside your last name. It's sitting inside you. In DNA, that no historical record, no plantation ledger, and no act of forced renaming was ever able to touch. That's the part worth getting right. That's the part worth telling accurately. And that's the part that, finally, in 2025, science is close enough to actually deliver.